All right, well, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for our monthly Washington Passport webinar. My name is Donna Quach. I serve as the program manager for the Washington Passport Network, and I'm with the College Success Foundation. We're really excited to have an opportunity to share some updates and basically a recap of the 2022 legislative session in Washington State and some of the changes that will be forthcoming and any kind of budget and implementation that changes and things that are relevant to the young people that we serve. Before we dive into the webinar, I do want to go through a few webinar information reminders. So the first one is that, again, this webinar is being recorded and it will be posted on the WPN YouTube channel in the future. All of you attendees have been muted. So if you have any questions, we encourage you to drop that in the Q&A, or you can use the chat function, and I'm monitoring that, and I will send those questions over to Juliet and Emily as we receive those. And then I do want to do a quick reminder about the Passport to Careers Conference, which is happening in April. On April 19th and 20th, we are offering our second virtual conference, and it's Passport to Careers. Registration is now open. I will drop the registration in the chat here. You can find more information about the schedule for the conference on the WPN or Washington Passport Network website, more information about our keynote speakers, which we're really excited about, and then all of the workshops that will be offered. And this year, the registration fee is $40, but if that is a barrier for anyone to participate, please reach out to our Passport team at CSF, and there are some scholarships available. We'd love to have as many WPN members join as they can over the 2 days. Oops. All right, at this time, I'm going to hand it over to our presenters. Oops, 1 second, it paused. Here we go.
All right, thanks, Donna. Can you hear me okay? Okay, great. Well, hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. For those I haven't met, I am Juliet Schindler. I'm the Director of Public Affairs and Strategic Partnerships at College Success Foundation. I've been with CSF for 8 years. And just for some brief background relevant to what we're discussing today, what that title includes is, in addition to, as the work you may know that I do with Passport, a big part of my job is government relations. So I lead our advocacy and government relations work here at CSF. Prior to that, I spent over a decade working for an elected official in Olympia. So that included being chief of staff for the Lieutenant Governor of Washington, which was how I really learned the ins and outs of, how bills become law and budgets get passed and all the fun stuff we're going to talk about today. So I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Emily, to introduce herself.
Thanks, Juliet. My name is Emily Stochel, and I'm the Interim Program Manager of Statewide Initiatives at the College Success Foundation. This year, I tracked and supported legislation in the foster care and unaccompanied homelessness space. And both of those areas I have lived expertise in as well. Pass it back to Juliet. Thanks.
Okay, so the agenda for today we're going to walk you through is basically, like Donna said, we're just going to do an overview of this year's short legislative session and give some of those highlights of the legislative session. Particularly, we're going to focus on legislation that was passed that's of interest to the WPN. And for those of you who may be joining who aren't part of the Washington Passport Network, it is focused on youth who have experienced care and or unaccompanied homelessness. I'm also going to touch on some of the bigger bills that made it through the process in just the bigger higher ed realm that also affect low-income underserved youth. And that will include some conversation about relevant items that were passed in the operating budget. And then what's next once that last gavel's dropped, what happens? Quick note, we will be talking today about the operating budget and not diving into transportation or or capital budget, which can also be relevant to the work, but the main issues come up through the operating budget. So that's our focus today. Next slide, please. The goals for today are for you as attendees to learn about key legislation related to youth in care and unaccompanied homelessness that passed, understand the new resources, funding, programs, and bills that will be implemented that will affect these youth, to obtain a sense of, and we won't spend a lot of time on this, but we're going to try to also give you a sense, this work is not done in a vacuum. There's really a tremendous amount of both formal and informal partnerships. Some are more, like I said, formalized and lasting, some are more based on a particular bill, and that's part of the way we achieve these goals. And then we're going to touch on some of these future work groups that, you know, as they develop and are carried out, may end up influencing your work. And quick aside, it's not just UW that has beautiful cherry blossoms. If you want to make a little Sunday trip down to Olympia, there's also some incredible cherry blossom viewing. So that was a little shout out to the Olympia cherry blossoms, which we got from a gift from Japan. I mean, this picture. So next slide, please. Okay, so again, you can see I'm promoting our beautiful capital, maybe because I haven't been going there, because of virtual session, it's bringing nostalgia. But what is the language? What are we talking about when we talk about a short session? So the short and long sessions alternate years. So this year was an even year, 22, and even years are when we have the short session, which the primary purpose of that 60-day session is to write a supplemental budget. And the purpose of a supplemental operating budget is to basically adjust based on the past year since the 2-year budget was written the year before, is to adjust for changes, to make corrections. So caseload forecasts are used to budget in the operating budget, and the caseloads might have changed. If the economy was hit, then caseloads can go up. There's more money needed to support those who are on these different government supports, for example. And if the revenue has, conversely, if the economy is doing well and revenue has gone up, then there are folks, plenty of folks and advocates and others and agencies, state agencies are saying, look, we have some real needs that we think could be filled by using with this extra revenue. So that's kind of the context for the supplemental budget. As far as legislation, at least in theory, this is not a year to pass many bills. I mean, supplemental budget years. It's supposed to be just kind of technical bills, cleanup bills. But in reality, there are a number of bills that get introduced, and some actually, you know, do make it through, as we'll see today. Whether it's a long session or a short session, the amount of bills that are dropped or proposed and crafted are far more than the bills that actually go through the process, and that's on purpose. That's the way the system was structured, so that more bills die than survive. Olympia has been under one-party control for the last several sessions, that being the Democratic Party, meaning the House of Representatives, the Senator, and the Governor's office are all under Democratic control. That obviously makes for a different dynamic than when you have a more bipartisan structure and numbers. And it means, for example, that the budget process really is, although there's input and influence from the Republican side of the aisle, really in the end, the big decisions on the budget are being made by the leading Democrat budget writers. Also, we're in a strong fiscal environment. We had significant revenue, and that just kept getting better as the session wore on, and we had the one-time infusion of ESSER dollars. So moving on to the next slide.
Yeah, thank you, Juliet. So I wanted to provide a little bit of context about how CSF's advocacy is related to the work that Washington Passport Network does. So for context, the Washington Passport Network is comprised of individuals who have various roles in supporting students who have experienced foster care or unaccompanied homelessness. Together, our focus is improving higher education outcomes for people who have experienced foster care or unaccompanied homelessness. And state policy affects this population greatly, which is why this is a major focus of CSF's advocacy work. So as I mentioned before, this legislative session, I followed and weighed in on bills that will have an impact on people who have had these experiences. Next slide. Thank you. So I wanted to highlight 4 bills that are really relevant to all you guys here. And first, I'm just listing them, but in the following slides, I will go over them a little bit more in depth. We'll do a deeper dive. But some of the bills are 1905, which came out of the House side. And this is for system of care grants and flexible funds for people experiencing homelessness. The second one is Senate Bill 5566, which is the expansion of the Independent Youth Housing Program, which I'm sure many of you are aware of. The next one is 1955, which is about creating uniformity in education requirements for students who are the subject of a dependency proceeding. And the last one is 5883, which is in regards to unaccompanied homeless youth being able to consent to healthcare. So I'll go through starting with House Bill 1905. Thanks, Donna. So House Bill 1905 is a really multifaceted bill, including block grants, flex funding, and other supports to ensure that youth exiting public systems of care don't discharge into homelessness. And public systems of care includes things like foster care, JR, which is juvenile rehabilitation, treatment, homelessness, and a few other things as well. So I just wanted to go through the funding breakdown because this bill does involve $5.2 million of funding, which is very substantial. And all of that new funding will become available on July 1st. So first, the first aspect of the bill is just over $2 million to Commerce and Office of Homeless Youth. And real quick, I will say I did leave an acronym key on the right. So if I use acronyms and don't list them out, feel free to reference that. But this first part of this funding is to expand the System of Care grant program to fund community-based services that prevent youth from exiting publicly systems of care into homelessness. Flexible funding is provided to individual youth that are exiting systems of care, and of those funds, $500,000 is provided for services to assist young adults discharging from behavioral health inpatient settings. And Donna will be dropping a couple of handouts in the chat too, so you can have more of this detailed information. And that will also include other bills and budget items that were passed to support adolescents in the state. But the second part of this bill and budget is a little over $2 million, again, to the Department of Commerce and Office of Homeless Youth. And this includes funding for 6 counties to implement the Housing Stability for Youth in Courts, otherwise known as HSYNC model, to prevent exits to homelessness from county juvenile detention facilities. Third, we have $427,000 to the Healthcare Authority. And that funding is provided for the Healthcare Authority to participate with other state agencies in rapid response teams that support youth and young adults exiting a publicly funded system of care. And then the last component of this funding for this bill is $341,000 to DCYF, which is the Department of Children, Youth and Families, for a rapid response team of representatives from relevant state agencies to respond to complex cases involving a youth exiting a publicly funded system of care. And I will note too that Representative Sen championed this bill, and she leads an adolescent work group, and we are talking about implementation in that group as well. I just learned before this webinar that the implementation for the flex funds will likely occur in June or July. And the other components of this bill should be able to be implemented a little sooner. And I will say too, with all the bills that I'm talking about, there is huge support from advocacy organizations and people that work with young people that are experiencing homelessness in foster care. For example, the Child Welfare and Advocacy Coalition, PEI, which is Project Education Impact, and other organizations and groups like that. And next slide, please. Thank you. So the next bill is going to do a deeper dive into is Senate Bill 5566, which is the expansion of the Independent Youth Housing Program. And this effort was championed by Senator Kuderer and was led also by the Office of Homeless Youth. And we did support this bill as well, along with other agencies. And this bill expands the eligibility of the Independent Youth Housing Program to include youth who are formally dependent at any time under the age of 25 and youth receiving extended foster care services. So I highlighted some of the major changes. It used to be that only people 4 months prior to their 18th birthday that were in care could access this program, but is now available to anyone who's experienced foster care that is under the age of 25. And secondly, eligible folks can receive services through age 24, and that used to be, the cutoff used to be age 22. And then, like I mentioned, the extended foster care eligibility has expanded as well. Before, young people had to choose between receiving extended foster care services and resources as well as the Independent Youth Housing Program, but now they can be dually enrolled and receive both the benefits of both programs. So that is a great win. And we do have a fact sheet for this bill as well. So I think Donna is going to be dropping that in the chat too. And real quick, this involves $4.1 million of funding to the Department of Commerce in order to implement the provisions of this bill. And it is estimated to serve an additional 250 young people. And I will go to the next one now. Thanks, Donna. Okay, the next one is House Bill 1955. And this bill creates uniformity in education requirements for students who are the subject of a dependency proceeding and expands resources to youth in trial return home status. This bill came out of the Project Education Impact Group. It was one of the recommendations that they had proposed, and Representative Rule championed this bill. And the whole intent of this bill is to improve the coordination of care for people experiencing foster care and to keep kids in their school of origin, and to also be able to provide resources to kids that are on a trial return home status, which it wasn't expanded to before. The effective date for this being implemented is June 9th, 2022, and it has been signed by the governor. Next slide, please. Thank you. Lastly, this Senate Bill 5883 is about accessibility to healthcare for youth experiencing unaccompanied homelessness. And this bill allows youth experiencing homelessness the ability to provide informed consent for non-emergency outpatient primary care services. So, and I will say too, this bill is championed by Senator Trudeau, who is an OG CSF alum, which is great. And this bill does include things like physical examinations, hearing examinations, vision examinations, and eyeglasses, dental exams, hearing aids, immunizations, treatments for illnesses and conditions, and routine follow-up care customarily provided by a healthcare provider in an outpatient setting, and it does exclude elective surgeries. So if you go to the next slide, I'll talk about too a few other bills that are a little relevant, but just give a brief summary of them. So Bill 1747 is a bill that supports relative placements in child welfare proceedings and expands the subsidy program to guardianships. And that one also goes into effect on June 9th, 2022, and it has been signed by the governor. 5788 is mainly a cleanup bill to address procedural problems around emergency guardianship placement for minors. And this bill essentially allows judges to provide immediate relief through emergency guardianships and allows the emergency guardianship and uniform guardianship petitions to be filed at the same time instead of separately. And lastly, 5793 was the governor is actually going to be taking action on this bill today, which is very exciting. This is a bill that authorizes stipends and reimbursement of expenses such as childcare and travel for participants on boards and commissions who are low income or have lived experience. So this involves $250,000 to the Office of Financial Management to implement this bill. Next slide, please. Thanks, Donna. So lastly, I just wanted to cover some of the main budget items that directly impact Washington Passport Network clients. So first, in the budget, we see $10.6 million to continue stipends for young people aging out of extended foster care during this pandemic. And this is going to be one-time funding. It's provided for monthly stipends to support young adults who have aged out of extended foster care during COVID-19. And this will be through June of 2022. The monthly stipends will be distributed through a contract with a nonprofit organization and must be even amounts each month to the degree feasible. And there is a 3% administrative fee also included in this fund amount. The second one is $325,000 to begin the fostering finances work to expand bank account access to youth in foster care. This might sound familiar to you. This previously was presented as a bill by Senator Nobles, Senate Bill 5824. Unfortunately, it didn't make it pass as a bill, but there is funding in the budget to start implementing parts of this. So they'll be working with Mockingbird Society and other organizations to help get this started. Third, we have funding for the Commerce to establish a lifeline support system pilot program to assist individuals exiting out of systems of care. And this will have a focus on youth and young adults. And as you can see, this involves $750,000. And it's an independent living lifeline. So when this bill was sort of being talked about in the beginning stages, the idea was some sort of like a 211 number that people could call, if, for example, they got a flat tire and didn't know what to do, then there would be that resource to be able to help out with that. Fourth, we have the $200,000 to reconvene the steering committee of lived experts. And this directs the Office of Homeless Youth to co-lead a work group on the prevention of youth and young adult homelessness with the Department of Children, Youth and Families and other state agency partners. And lastly, we have the adolescent housing pilot, which is exactly $1,292,000. We just said 1.3 million to keep it short. But this funding is provided for an emergency adolescent housing pilot program and for associated support staff. And this funding is part of DCYF's decision package to manage the amount of exceptional placements for kids that come into care and don't have a place to go. And it is specifically for 16 and 17-year-olds that come into care. And those are the main ones I wanted to cover. So I'd love to pass it off to Juliet to speak about the bills in higher education. And you're muted, Juliet.
Thank you. Thanks, Emily. As you can see, there really was a lot of really great legislation passed that's relevant to the work that the WPN members do, and some pretty exciting progress there, particularly for a short session. So now I'm going to bring us back up a level to talk about kind of higher ed in general, particularly focused on underserved youth, low-income youth. So overall, this legislative session, there was an increase of 8.6% in total state spending. For higher ed, specific spending increase, it was at 2.5%. And higher ed as a percentage of overall spending is not a huge amount. It's always fairly small. That 2.5% actually excludes a one-time investment for a student loan program, which we'll talk about just as an aside. So, and some of the some of the the overarching theme of the higher ed policies and investments that passed this year is looking to cover the costs of post-secondary education. And this is done through an expansion of the Washington College Grant, which is the successor to the State Need Grant, the leading need-based financial aid program in our state and leading really in the nationally as well. To cover costs above and beyond tuition and fees, there's been a really growing understanding that tuition is not the only financial barrier, that there's a lot of other financial barriers. And then creating new loan options for students. Also seeking to increase access to financial aid and to really increase our post-secondary enrollment. And then a focus on certain pathways, career pathways to respond to industry growth and the demand that we see. And that again is a continuation of what we've been seeing a lot of focus on with our employers' need for qualified staff who have the appropriate credentials. And then also addressing students' basic needs, housing, mental health, and other health care. And I think the pandemic really shown, as you all know, shown a spotlight on this, on the needs that are there. So for us at the College Success Foundation, in general, you can group our legislative priorities, like throughout the years, into kind of 3 post-secondary buckets. And to put it simply, access, affordability, and student supports. So I will kind of be using that lens today as I talk about some of these bills that emerged this session. So the chair of Senate Higher Ed is Representative Vandana Slaughter, and she led the effort to do a further expansion for eligibility for the Washington College Grant. Again, this is the State Need Grant, but that has been really made a much more viable and reliable source because it is guaranteed funding, unlike the State Need Grant, which was always short every year. So that's State Need Grant, and now Washington College Grant has been kind of right at the top of CSF and others' priorities over the years. So now it is expanded. She was able to secure an additional $317 million over the next 4 years. And that means that the median family income will be expanded from 55% to 60%. So if that's getting more into that lower middle income eligibility for students. And she also was able to have the bill establish a bridge grant pilot program. This will provide $500 awards to students who are receiving the max Washington College Grant, but are not college-bound students. The rationale being they already get this additional dollars for books and fees. So this bridge grant will go to these students who receive the max Washington College Grant, and that will cover non-tuition related expenses such as food, housing, and all the rest. Next slide, please, Donna. Also under the affordability department, we have Representative Sullivan had a very ambitious student loan program bill. Originally, he asked for it to be funded at $300 million. It came out of the House being zeroed out and made into a study. Just to give you a little of the political context that goes into some of these negotiations, Representative Sullivan is retiring after this session or this term, and he has been in House leadership for a number of years. There's a lot of respect for him, and this was this bill was positioned as kind of one of his last big victories that he wanted to retire with. So according to those on the inside, he was not happy when it was zeroed out and made into a study. So ultimately, the compromise led to this result, which is a one-time $150 million investment to develop the student loan program. So the Washington Student Achievement Council, in consultation with the state treasurer and the Washington State Investment Board, will work on designing it. They'll submit a report by the end of this year. So a pretty aggressive timeline about the feasibility in order to try to start awarding the loans beginning the 24-25 academic year. And the idea is it would be likely a 1% interest rate, so a low interest rate subsidized loan for low-income students that would have flexible repayment options, and would be unusual and it's available to both undergrad and graduate students. And as is typical, some other in our Washington State, in this case, they are, I don't know how they're going to define this, but they are encouraging, particularly for those who are in high demand fields. And those are usually thought of as STEM fields or similar high demand fields. Next slide, please. Also under kind of access and affordability, Senator Randall, who's the chair of the Senate Higher Ed Committee, so this was a WASAC, Washington Student Achievement Council request bill. Agencies can request legislation, and then it did make sense for her to, as chair of higher ed for the Senate, to be the prime sponsor. But she was happy to do that, and this was another situation where originally it was 50 million. No, it was over 100 million proposed initially by WASAC. The governor's budget came out with 50 million. And in the end, due to some of the dynamics on all the different competitive proposals for higher ed dollars, it's only funded at 6 million. But this will be the first time that we have this new program, this College and Career Pathways Innovations Challenge program. So I'm sure it'll get shortened because that's a mouthful. And the idea is regional grants. So competitive grants will be granted to partnerships, and one of the key is having this mix of K-12, higher ed, and community-based organizations partnering in their region to increase post-secondary enrollment, which includes FAFSA and WASFA completion, to do this in a way that closes the equity gaps, that expands the use of work-based learning, so career-connected learning or work-based learning. It has an eye to financial support that goes beyond tuition, and then also has some matching funds built in. So because these are regional and they're innovation grants, they'll look different in the different regions, but those are the concepts that are built into this program. One of the other areas we've been supporting and working on some work groups and development work is dual credit. Dual credit is important in our eyes, and based on research for low-income students, because not only does it help reduce the overall cost if they're able to get free or affordable credit while the student is still a K-12 student, that then gets them a head start, obviously, on their post-secondary work, and therefore, in the long run, will be less dollars spent for their post-secondary degree. But the research also shows that students who have taken dual credit, whether it's Running Start, college and the high school, overall tend to enroll and persist in post-secondary. And anecdotally, it would make sense, if there's this comfort level and familiarity, rather than moving on to the unknown of college in the fall after graduating. So it's grant funding to support these high school students who have fewer than 15 credits to help them get their AA, and then also to pay their community technical college fees so that they could work with a community or technical college to get those credits in that summer after high school graduation. Next slide, please. And then access, affordability, and support. These couple bills, kind of hit a number of those areas. There's a budget proviso for $2.72 million, which gives funds to the State Board of Community and Technical Colleges, and each of the community and technical colleges in this next fiscal year would get funds to contract with a community-based organization to work to increase financial aid access and support in the community. So that those details still need to be worked out how that looks, but that will be managed by, like I say, SBCTC. And then a huge bill, which really includes a lot of different pieces, and it's sponsored or prime sponsored by Representative Hansen, who has been very prolific in his support of higher ed bills over the years. Is number 1835, and it puts 3.2 million into this variety of approaches to increase enrollment. A big part of it is the focus on FAFSA and WASFA completion of filing. I think probably everyone here is aware of the importance of filing your the student's FAFSA or WASFA in order to both see that opportunities, financial opportunities available to them, and also just the fact that once the student has filed, data shows there's a higher percentage of probability that they do go on to post-secondary. Just through the act of filing, it's a boost. So there will be the State Library Administrative Grant Pilot Program to increase those rates. Like the state library or libraries have already been involved on some level with these kind of financial aid projects. There will be other efforts such as CTCs providing outreach specialists to go to the high schools to work with students and give them that direct support. Really, FAFSA WASFA filing, it's difficult, it's challenging. First generation kids don't have their parents' experience to help them. So we have seen through our work and our partners, this is really important to have those adults with the knowledge and support to come in and help. We've also seen through some survey work that's been done with partners that although we have, like I've said, this amazing need-based program in the Washington College Grant, there is not enough awareness and understanding of it. Not enough low-income potential students are aware that this funding is there. So this is a real effort to do a statewide, like basically an advertising campaign, so that you might, it's still to be determined, but you might even see, like billboards, or flyers, but it'll mostly be, I think, through like social media and just getting the experts who know how to reach the audiences to really get that word out there. And then I thought it would be of interest to this group too to know that part of the bill includes that WASAC and DSHS will be doing some data sharing to help increase the utilization of the Washington College Grant. Okay, next slide, please. And then again, with the State Board of Community and Technical Colleges, there is a student supports homeless or foster college student pilot. And it's actually an expansion of an existing pilot, expanding it to all 34 of the community and technical colleges. Originally, the pilot was for just a discrete number of the CTCs. So for the next fiscal year, the funds will be provided to expand it to also 2 more public 4 years. So expanded to all 34 CTCs and 2 additional public 4 years. And there's also a career launch grant at $1 million budget proviso. And again, WASAC, this is also giving you a sense of how much WASAC gets added to their plate after these bills go through. Lots of work there. So they will be administering grants to public 4-year institutions to expand career-connected learning partnership and programs. Next slide, please. Okay, so you go through the 60-day session, which ended on time. It's, especially in the short session, it's very intense. This year we found quite intense. And then you celebrate on signing a die if your funding was in the budget, if your bills were passed through the legislature, goes the whole process. Then, of course, the next step is all the bills need to be signed by the governor. And in some cases, there might be some line item vetoes. It might have to go back to the legislature to override a veto. It's not that common, but it's still something out there, that hurdle to get through. So one of the big bills that we've been waiting to get signed is, of course, the operating budget, and that is actually happening tomorrow. So I think there'll be a lot of eyes on that. Governor Inslee signing that tomorrow. Then once the budgets, including the bills, including the budget signed, then it's time for the next steps, the implementation. So where they're setting up work groups or these grant pilot programs or other grant programs, those all need to then be put into place. And as you can see, a lot of it falls on the agencies, the state agencies. These work groups sometimes are comprised, are in the statute language, said be comprised of these members of these representatives of different groups, including, in some cases, certain members of the legislature, certain members of commissions, members of kind of public and populations. So a fair amount of work can go into just creating these. There might need to be a fiscal administrator for some of the grant programs. And then for those that require money, the fiscal year starts July 1st. So
I think we lost Juliet, so I'll hop in meanwhile.
Thanks, Emily.
Of course, yeah. So the fiscal year, as Juliet was saying, ends, and then the new one begins July 1st. And during that time too, we do interim work where we build relationships with legislators and talk about what we want to see happen during the next legislative session. And I'll let Juliet sort of hop in when she gets better reception, because I think there are a few comments she wanted to make. But I did also cover some of the implementation that will happen with the bills that I spoke about. And for example, for the independent youth housing program, that includes, serving a wider range of students and also expanding eligibility. So you might have students now who you thought may have been aging out of that service, but might now be eligible for another additional 2 years. And then, of course, we have more unrestricted support for people exiting systems of care from House Bill 1905. So we should be seeing more of that, more of those resources coming into play and being able to support students with that. And also there's more services for K through 12 students, independency proceedings, and especially those who are on a trial return home. Next slide, please. Thank you. So we do have some legislative changes ahead and a lot of transitions within the people who are involved in the Senate and the House of Representatives. So this is sort of just a list that outlines some of those changes. So the House members that are not seeking re-election as they're running for Senate is Rep. Drew McEwen. He's a Republican. We have Representative Matt Boakney. I'm sorry, I do not know how to say these. I'm sure Juliet would do a much better job, so please excuse my mispronunciations. Representative Jesse Young, Representative Javier Valdez, and Representative Noel Frame. And Senate members not seeking re-election are Tim Shelton, Senator Sharon Brown, Senator Reuben Carlisle, Senator David Frocht, and Senator Keith Wagoner. And I will say too, I think the reason that Senator Reuben Carlisle is bolded is because he has been a huge champion in making sure that we have funding for college services and just a huge support of CSF as well. And I actually am not going to go through all of these because we are running a little short on time and I want to make sure we have time for questions and answers. But you can see the House members on the right side of the screen, and we will be sending this out afterwards as well. Juliet, is there anything on this slide you wanted to highlight?
Yeah, so, I actually don't know where you guys stopped hearing me because I didn't realize I dropped off because I was looking at my notes. But yes, that is why I highlighted Senator Reuben Carlisle. He was the, the mastermind behind the passport program, as you know. So that's major. And there's other members here who have really been huge champions for the youth we serve in higher ed. Representative Sells was involved, for example, with legislation for youth experiencing homelessness. Senator Frocht has been, whether or not he was on higher ed, has been a great champion. Representative Dolan has been a huge champion for College Bound scholarship. I think many of us are regretting seeing that Representative Jesse Johnson is not continuing on. He's only been here a short while, but it's just been such a wonderful member. But he has wants to support his wife with her career. So anyway, the main gist here though is there are quite a few changes we're seeing coming, and it could change the makeup of the legislature. At the beginning, I talked about the Democrats holding all three chambers, including the governor's office. That could shift, especially with all these House members not seeking re-election. What I was saying, I think when I didn't realize I was no longer on, this with the work groups and everything being put into place, and then the work begins at the same, and then folks are meeting with their legislators. Really, that's the time to have thoughtful conversations about legislation that's needed, rather than during the session when you already should really have that pretty well baked, and there's really not time to be as thoughtful. At the same time, legislators will be distracted, many of them, because of the election this year. So that's kind of an opposing force to that more thoughtful interim time period. That a lot of them will be looking towards early November and really having to focus on their election. And there's certain periods that there's restrictions on them around the election time where on what they can and can't do. So because there's that awareness of like funds and messaging that goes towards the campaign versus their work as a policymaker. So stay tuned for that. But if you do have questions on, anything to do with this, but including, how does that look to reach out to a legislator? Who do I talk to? How do I know if they say, they're currently in a blackout period because elections, what does that mean? Any of those things. It's a complicated world, but of advocacy, but there's a lot of great supporters in this work. I really just relish all the partners. For those of you who are out there, it's amazing to do this work with you. And I think we can just move on to the next slide and open it up for questions. I can't see them because I had to hop back on. So
Yeah, thank you, Juliet and Emily. I'm gonna leave the floor open to see if there are any questions or comments that come through the chat. I don't see any right now. Okay, well, I don't see any comments or questions coming through, so I think that, if you do have any questions, let me see, there is our presenters' contact info. Oh, that's Piper and Finn. Those are Juliet's and Emily's dogs. If you have any questions for our team in the future on anything that Juliet or Emily presented, please feel free to reach out to either of them. Great, thank you, Melissa and David. We hope to see you all. Thank you for joining us for this webinar, and we hope to see you at our Passport Conference on April 19th and 20th. Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Thanks so much.
thank you guys. Take care.